Good afternoon or morning, depending on where you're calling in from. My name is Paige Rivard, CEO of PWSA USA. I'm thrilled to welcome everyone to our Drug Development and Clinical Trials 101 webinar. We have 4 amazing speakers with us today who will walk us through the drug discovery and development process, clinical trials phases, and end with education on the new drug application and approval process. Our panelists today are Dean Carson, Vice President of Scientific Affairs, Saniona, Kristen Yen, Vice President of Clinical Operations, Soleno Therapeutics, Jessica Ernest, Vice President of Clinical Operations, Levo Therapeutics, and Michelle Roy, Vice President of Regulatory Affairs, Harmony Biosciences. I would also like to remind everyone that our webinar today is not intended to answer specific questions around current drug trials or where these companies may be in their FDA process. This is truly an educational webinar on the clinical trials process. We will also be hosting a joint webinar in April with FPWR to further discuss this topic and get more detail around the role of the PWS community in the process. We will also be allowing time at the end of the webinar for Q&A, so please feel free to type your questions in the Q&A section versus the chat box. So without further ado, I would like to turn the webinar over to Dean Carson to get us started. Dean?
Because it may not be relieving to hear that we are often as confused as you all are by these things, but that's part of the challenge, and we all step up to the plate to work through that. I'm going to be talking about the early stage discovery through phase 1 clinical trials process. And I want to talk first a little bit about why drug discovery and development is important to me specifically. So my brother has a prolactinoma, which is a rare hormone-producing tumor in the anterior pituitary gland. As the name suggests, the hormone that is produced by this tumor is prolactin. And he's treated quite well with a drug called cabergoline, which is a small molecule. It's delivered orally. And it is a potent dopamine D2 receptor agonist. And what this does is blocks the pituitary's production of prolactin to get his prolactin levels to a normal range. And cabergoline is an ergot derivative. And ergot is a fungus that grows on rye and related plants, various different grains, and produces alkaloids that can cause ergotism in humans and animals that eat the contaminated grain. And ergotism manifests in these symptoms of things such as painful seizures, mania, psychosis, headaches, nausea, and vomiting. I've always thought that was incredibly fascinating, that a substance that is essentially a poison can be transformed into a therapeutic to treat a complex rare disease. So I've been fascinated by the drug development process since early on, and I'll talk a little bit about my experience in participating in the drug development process, not only as a scientist, but also as a participant in clinical trials. And drug discovery is, the underpinning science of drug discovery is pharmacology. Pharmacology is the science of how drugs and biologics act on biological systems and how the system responds to the drug. And the whole point of doing this is to be able to bring new medicines to market to treat, the very broad range of diseases that impact humans, and also animals as well. This is the same process for developing veterinary medicine. And it starts off with basic science. You might have heard this term, basic science. I always thought this was confusing because to me, the basic sciences are actually the most complicated and challenging. We're talking about very detailed, in-depth chemistry and biology. There's nothing basic about it. But that gets translated once it's developed to a point in which we have a pretty good understanding about how these new compounds are impacting on various different models of disease states. They get translated into the clinical development process. And I'm just going to move my screen here so I can see my slides. So the end game really is about having a broad range of drugs available to doctors, pharmacists, dentists, and veterinarians so they can treat the broad range of diseases that exist. Next slide. And pharmacology is what we call a mechanism-driven field. So we're interested in the mechanism of action of drugs, and we're interested in the mechanism of action of these drugs first and foremost to understand where they might have efficacy in the treatment of disease. But in understanding the mechanism of action, we also might have some predictive value in determining the possible toxicity of these drugs as well. And in some cases, we understand this mechanism of action so well that we know that there's a certain toxicity that is going to occur. Now, I'll talk a little bit later about that. It really comes down to weighing off the pros and cons against, there might be treatment of a disease, but there might be an impact on healthy aspects of the organism as well. In this case, we're talking about humans. You might be getting what are called off-target effects from the disease that lead to side effects. And it's about understanding, is it worth the risk in treating the disease with this drug if we know that there's going to be this side effect profile as well. Now, nearly all experimental therapeutics have a defined mechanism of action. It might not be really well defined. Sometimes it's incredibly well defined, sometimes it's loosely defined, but this drives our ability to apply these drugs into various different disease states. And in some cases, there are companion diagnostics as well that allow researchers to track the mechanistic engagement in complex systems. I think it's important to point out here, so Paracelsus, who's kind of the godfather of pharmacology, was known for stating that it's the dose that makes the poison. And this is incredibly important. Pretty much everything is poisonous. Water is poisonous if you drink too much of it. So drugs as well, drugs can be therapeutic or drugs can be poisonous depending on the dose. So this is a big part of what this early drug discovery process is about, is understanding the appropriate dose. Next slide. As I mentioned, I'm going to be talking about these two early stage aspects of drug development. So the discovery or preclinical phase typically is, if you think about the white lab coat scientists with, gloves and goggles on, working in complex machinery and working with animal models, testing different compounds. That's what the early stage discovery and preclinical work is. This is where a lot of patent work is applied as well. So when we discover new inventions that is patented, that provides protection and allows us to develop that drug and know that there's going to be a financial return once we get to market. So other people won't be able to come in immediately and replicate that technology. Now it says here 3 to 6 years. It could be less than that. Mostly it's going to be more than that. It can be incredibly long. Phase 1 studies, though, by the time we get to phase 1 studies, this is mostly in healthy individuals, small numbers of healthy individuals, and we will primarily be looking at the safety of the drug. And these studies could be anywhere as short as 6 months or up to 18 months, sometimes a little bit longer. My colleagues are going to talk about the other stages, so I won't get into that. Now, this is an incredibly high risk and high cost business. These numbers here are really shocking. The process of discovering a new drug and conducting clinical trials to ensure that those drugs are safe and effective is estimated to take 15 years and cost up to $2.6 billion on average. Now, the on average bit, that's an important thing to point out. We're talking about taking into consideration all the drugs that are attempted to be developed, not just the ones that actually come to market. So this number takes into consideration the massive number of failures that happen along the way as well. And you can see here, this is an example of the types of failure rates that we see. During the discovery process, it takes 5,000 to 10,000 compounds just to get 5 that would be worth advancing into the clinical development process, that is into human studies. And for those 5 compounds that make it into clinical trials, the likelihood of receiving FDA approval is about 12%. So, I think these numbers are very sobering to understand the complexity and the challenges of drug development, and not to be so depressing about it. I will point out that there are, even with all of those challenges, a good number of drugs that are approved by the FDA each year. And here's a table with the last 5 years worth of drug development. So you can see New drugs are coming to market. And if you want to see what those are, that link there as well outlines all of those different therapies, and every year that's updated. Next slide. And it is very much a team sport, this process. So we have to utilize the expertise of a multitude of different scientific disciplines and clinical specialists. Everybody comes together to try to make the process as smooth as possible and to try to get the drugs to market as quick as possible. This is important for treating diseases where there's a high unmet need, and it's important for the companies and for their shareholders that the drugs are made available, because obviously then they're going to get a return on the investment that they put into the drug development process. Next slide. And these are some of the key aspects of the early discovery process. So discovery biology, that's understanding the mechanism of disease. So what if we know that there is a clinical disease state, being able to replicate that and model that in an animal model, and then unpack the biology of that disease to really understand what has gone wrong that leads to this disorder having such a negative impact. And discovery chemistry is trying to understand the development of new chemical entities where those drugs can be applied to maybe then correct some of that dysregulated biology. Now we go through a whole bunch of different testing. You would know, this in vitro pharmacology, that's really what you would know as, the test tube or the Petri dish research that you see people in white lab coats doing. And then in silico models, this is an interesting term. It's become much more popular in recent years as artificial intelligence has really ramped up. And this allows you to do really kind of rapid modeling to understand how your chemical might impact on various different biological systems. And then we do what is known as ex vivo studies in human tissue. So taking human tissue, maybe from a disease state, maybe from a healthy individual, and applying the drug into those tissues to see how it impacts, and make sure that we're not taking such a massive leap from the animal models into the into humans, that there would be a lot lost in the process. And then we go about the in vivo pharmacology and efficacy assessment. And this is where we create complicated animal models. For example, maybe a MAGEL2 knockout mouse model of Prader-Willi syndrome. And that might be the best example of Prader-Willi syndrome that we have in an animal model. And then we can test these drugs that we've discovered along this pathway and see how they impact on behavior and development. Here's a little video just outlining, I don't think the sound is going to work, but you'll just see some of that white lab coat work going on at Saniona and the various different technology that we use. So there's a lot of very expensive, very complicated technology that we have available to us to be able to do this entire discovery process in-house. So Saniona is actually a Danish company. We're headquartered in Copenhagen, and that's where all of our research labs are located. And we've recently built out a team in Waltham, Massachusetts, and the company is growing as we progress into clinical trials in various different diseases, including Prader-Willi syndrome. So you can see there, a very large library of drug compounds. And as I mentioned, you're seeing huge failure rates. So the more that we have, the better chance that we have of success. Next slide. So I'm just going to touch a little bit here on phase 1 studies. So as I mentioned, these are typically healthy volunteer studies. You probably heard this jargon, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled. I think my colleagues will get into this a little bit later, but that's essentially to try to minimize any bias that might exist by having the researchers know what's going on, or having the participants in the study know what's going on. So we make sure that we have a dummy compound against the real compound, and nobody knows whether the participant has been given the dummy or the real compound. The point of phase 1 studies is to investigate primarily the safety and tolerability and to identify maximally tolerated doses. So then when we go into the phase 2 efficacy studies, we can know what dose is needed to start in testing the patient population. And in these studies, phase 1 studies, we can also look at things like drug-drug interactions. There might be a drug that is commonly used in a particular disease state that we're focused on. So we might also dose the participants, healthy volunteers, with that commonly used drug and determine how our new compound is going to interact with that commonly used drug to make sure that there's no negative interactions there or that we can predict what will happen. Also, food interactions and absorption are incredibly important here as well. And we might be interested in looking at, the different effects that this drug might have in various populations. So those, between different ages or gender, pre-existing conditions, for example, are important as well. Next slide. I should say too here, actually, it's important for me, as I mentioned from the outset, that I've been involved in the drug development process as a participant as well, having family members that have various illnesses. It's been important for me from a young age that I am actively participating in this process and not passively waiting for drugs to come to market. So in my time, I've participated in, I think, 4 or 5 phase 1 clinical trials. I've had family members and friends that I've encouraged to participate in studies join those as well. That was a very eye-opening experience and really great to be, on the inside of it and seeing what happens. And it makes it easier for me to do my job, knowing what it's like to also be a participant in a clinical trial. I want to talk a little bit about the clinical pharmacology. So 2 areas that, as I mentioned before, the main area is in understanding the safety and tolerability of a drug. And we want to be able to select appropriate doses. So in selecting appropriate doses, we want to know what does the body do to a drug once it's in the system. And this is calculated using complicated mathematical equations. And there are 4 main processes involved, actually 5. What has now become really important is understanding the liberation. That is that, if you took a tablet, what does the body do to that tablet to then liberate that the important chemical from that tablet to then be able to have its effect on the biological system. And then absorption, how quickly that drug absorbs, how broadly it's distributed in different compartments. Does it make its way into the central nervous system? Does it stay in the peripheral nervous system? How long does it stay in the blood, for example? And then metabolism, how quickly is that drug broken down? And elimination, how quickly is it eliminated from the body or excreted from the body? Now, pharmacodynamics is actually something more, a major focus of what I do is, what are the drug actions on the body, or what does the drug do to the body? And this is assessed using a wide variety of measurement tools, depending on the drug's mechanism and the disease state of interest. So we might look at this in phase 1 studies as well. If we have a drug that is a cardiovascular drug, let's say it's a blood pressure treatment, in phase 1, we can still look to see what happens in the healthy volunteers, what happens to their heart function. If it's a hormone-based drug, if it's for endocrinology, then we can do hormone measurement and see what changes might occur there. If it's for psychiatry, we might be looking for emotional changes or behavioral signs. Next slide. And just to break down the pharmacokinetics a little bit more, there are different things that we're looking at in a phase 1 study. What is the maximum concentration of a drug? How long did it take for to get to that maximum concentration? The area under the curve, that is from start to finish, kind of how much of the drug has, how much of that drug an individual has been exposed to, the rate in which the drug was absorbed, and the rate in which it was eliminated from the system as well. And pharmacogenomics, although relatively new, has become an incredibly important part of drug development, because we know that there are certain genotypes in which people are metabolizing drugs faster or slower than other people. And there are certain genotypes in which people might have negative effects from certain drugs as well. And you would have, I think, been become more familiar with this, with the all of the different drugs that have been tested in Prader-Willi syndrome. We know that there are subcutaneous delivery that's been tried, oral drugs and intranasal, and all of these different routes of administration are incredibly important for understanding the drug's pharmacokinetics. And then you've probably heard as well over the years, all of these different terms for the dosage regime that an individual would be taking these drugs. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about adverse drug reactions. So I mentioned before about the risk-benefit ratio. So there's some toxicities that can be managed and might even be acceptable, while others are just unacceptable. So for example, if we're treating a very aggressive malignant cancer, it might be acceptable to have a side effect profile that is, the toxicity is quite high, but if the cancer is treated effectively or even cured, then it's acceptable to have that short-term toxicity that can be effectively managed. If it's for the treatment of hypertension, then it might be unacceptable that we have incredibly severe side effects. And again, I mentioned too just before about the pharmacogenomics. So we know that there are certain genetic predispositions to having an adverse drug reaction, and it's important to test for that or to understand the risks that might be involved there. I'll talk a little bit about thalidomide. This is always a really good one. I think most people remember the tragedy that occurred with thalidomide, which was approved in many countries for sedation and was used in pregnant women to help with sleep during pregnancy. But when their children were born, they had incredibly severe birth defects, and this drug was taken off the market. And I think having a better understanding about the predictive toxicity of the drug's mechanism of action, then this could have been avoided. But at that time, that research was not being performed, at least not for that compound. Next slide, please. Drug repurposing is a good way to shortcut and cut costs off this incredibly high-risk drug development process. And in Prader-Willi syndrome, there's been a number of cases of drug repurposing as well. You've all heard about intranasal oxytocin or intranasal carbetocin. DCCR is a version of a drug that's already on the market as well. And so this helps with understanding what the drug safety profile is like, and might help to avoid some of the incredibly expensive and time-consuming early research that goes into the drug development process, given that it's already been done for other indications. And there's also a potential for the reuse of drugs that are known to be incredibly toxic and might have caused some real problems. And to continue on with this thalidomide example, thalidomide had actually been shown in some just kind of random clinical observations to be of benefit for the treatment of complications of leprosy, and was actually approved for that use. And in a target development process, and what I mean by that is that it actually trying to look at how the mechanism of action of thalidomide might be relevant for the treatment of multiple myeloma, as opposed to just randomly observing it in clinical settings. The drug was also brought to market for that disease. Now, it does have a special restricted distribution program in place to make sure that it doesn't end up causing the same problems of the birth defects as previously seen. And here's a list of just a handful. There's a big, long list of drugs that have been repurposed, but here's a few that have been repurposed that you might be familiar with. And I think the next slide is my last slide. I wanted to point you in the direction of some resources where you can do some self-teaching around clinical trials. And I want to remind you as well, I know that sometimes this all seems really overwhelming and there's all this esoteric, complicated jargon that's used. Like I said, it confuses us. It's just a part of the process. But accessing these resources that are out there, the NIH and the FDA, I think do a good job in trying to make this information more accessible. You can go and you can look at some of these resources and start to hopefully familiarize yourself with them, and then that way you'll be better equipped as you move to either put yourself or a family member into a clinical trial. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you, Dean. Hello, and thank you to the PWSA USA organization for having us here today, and to you for your interest in learning more about drug development. My name is Jessica Ernest, and I work on managing the clinical trials at Levo Therapeutics. And Kristen Yen from Soleno and I will be taking you through the phase of drug development where testing is conducted in human volunteers. Dean had already gone through phase 1, so we'll take you through phase 2 and phase 3. Next slide, thank you. So I'll start with the definition of a clinical trial. Clinical trials are research studies that involve volunteers with a purpose to test a specific intervention, such as a drug, a procedure, or a device. And there can be two types of clinical trials. One is an interventional trial, which means that the participant is given a new treatment or a treatment that's not new, but being tested for the first time in that certain use. Or an observational trial is just like it sounds. There's no intervention given, but the participant is just observed for the purpose of collecting data and information. And clinical trials progress in a series of steps called phases, which I'll go through in more detail in a minute. And trials have a number of goals, with the primary goal to gather safety and efficacy information of the product being tested. And lastly, the funding for clinical trials can come from a variety of sources. The most common is from industry or a pharmaceutical company like us here today, or voluntary groups where funds raised go for research such as your well-known PWS organizations or federal agencies like the National Institute of Health or NIH, or the FDA even has certain grant programs where they can fund portions of clinical research. Next slide. So shown here is a high-level overview of the stages of clinical development. Dean has taken us through discovery and stage and phase 1. Now we'll move on to phase 2 and 3 and what goes into conducting these larger and later stage trials. We have listed here the traditional definitions for patient numbers for phase 1, 2, and 3 trials, but please know that these are not necessarily rigid requirements. And particularly in rare disorders, the FDA and sponsors can work together to figure out what type and sequence of trials are needed to demonstrate safety and efficacy for the patient group being studied. Next slide. Okay, before any testing in humans can begin, an application called an Investigational New Drug Application, or an IND for short, is submitted to the FDA. And today we'll be referencing the FDA mostly because the audience is US-based, but the same type of application is required for any country where you will enroll participants. And it can be referred to also as a clinical trial application in other countries. And the application is quite extensive, as you would likely expect, and follows a set of regulations within the Code of Federal Regulations, or CFR for short. And those conducting any part of clinical research are very familiar with these regulations, in particular the part that pertains to food and drug, which is Part 21. And you can find the full list. It's probably not too interesting of a read, but you can find the full list of these regulations on the FDA's website. And within this IND application, the sponsor has to show all data for the animal testing that was conducted to permit an assessment as to whether the product is reasonably safe for initial testing in humans, like what Dean had just gone through. And the sponsor also provides detail on how the drug is made, what is in the drug product, and lastly, the plan for the clinical studies is included in the application, with the goal for the agency to assess whether the initial phase trials will expose participants to any unnecessary risk. There is a time clock that the FDA has, so 30 days that they have to review that IND application. And if it passes, it will be considered cleared, or if it's accepted. And it is a living application where any new trial that the sponsor will conduct needs to be submitted under that IND, and it will go through that same review process. Okay, next slide. So if your phase 1 study has gathered information on a safe and tolerable dose of the product, a phase 2 study may begin. And again, as mentioned earlier, the study would have to be cleared by the FDA as part of the IND. These studies are on a group of participants with the disease or disorder that the product is trying to treat, and they can range in size from several hundred participants for those more common disorders, or in rare diseases like Prader-Willi syndrome can be quite small, possibly only 30 to 80 patients. The studies are typically conducted at more than one location, in particular in rare disease, to try to be able to recruit that many patients, and could be in several countries depending on the disease. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see a series of arrows. So that shows you the average amount of time each phase can take. With phase 1, it could be several months to complete that trial, and phase 2 studies can take up to a couple of years to complete. Next slide. The goals of a phase 2 study are to continue to assess the safety of the drug, of course, in all trials, and now in a larger group of patients, and those with the disorder or disease are being studied. So the main goal really is to determine how well the drug works or how effective it is to treat the disorder. In order to test that effectiveness, typically these studies will include a comparison group, which is a placebo or an active comparator, which could be a drug that's already used for the treatment of the disease or the disorder. Researchers are trying to answer the question, does it relieve, does it reverse, or does it stop the progression of the condition? And according to the FDA, fewer treatments even make it past this stage, around 1/3 of treatments that make it to phase 2. Next slide. So if in phase 2 you have demonstrated efficacy of your product and determined that it's well tolerated, a phase 3 trial may begin. This is the last step in the largest of trials that are run on products that are still not approved by a regulatory agency for that particular indication. It will always be tested in a group of patients that have the disease or disorder and could be several hundred to many thousand participants. For example, if you look at the recent COVID vaccine trials that you may be familiar with hearing in the news, the Pfizer phase 3 trials enrolled just under 45,000 participants. I think the Moderna trial was around 30,000 participants, way more than we could ever enroll in a rare disease trial. And again, in rare disease studies, it's very challenging to be able to enroll participants. So the trials are usually much, much smaller and could have a range between 100 and 150 patients as an estimate. So very different from those large vaccine trials. And it's still challenging even to get that number of patients in a rare disease study. So for example, in the PWS trials, it can take several years to enroll the patients that are needed to adequately demonstrate the product safety and effectiveness. So with that being said, I'd like to express our gratitude and thanks to the families that have participated in clinical trials, or you've tried to participate or thought about participating in a clinical research trial. They sometimes can be a lot to ask of the family, but please know that your participation is so incredibly valuable, especially in rare disease where there's such a small pool of eligible patients. That really means that each participant greatly contributes to the overall goal of the study. Phase 3 trials are usually at many clinical sites, again, to try to get that number of patients that you need, and can span across several countries to allow your enrollment in a reasonable amount of time. These trials can take anywhere from 1 to 4 or even more years to complete. Next slide. The goal of phase 3 is to confirm what you showed in phase 2. So it's a confirmatory trial, and you're trying to demonstrate whether or not the product offers benefit to a specific patient population, and those benefits outweigh the risk of the product. So these studies can be referred to as pivotal studies and almost always include a comparator, which could be a placebo or another approved product, to determine if the treatment you're testing is effective, or if it's less effective or the same effectiveness. These trials are also an opportunity to gather more safety information on a larger group of patients and patients for a longer duration of treatment to monitor any longer term side effects or rare side effects. Next slide, please. So here are some common clinical trial terms that if you're being introduced to a study or have participated, these may sound familiar to you. The term randomized is just like it sounds, it's a random assignment. Typically, phase 3 studies are randomized, meaning that it's a random chance for the participant to either receive active study treatment or a comparator. Again, so we're not introducing bias with who receives what treatment. And trials can have a placebo or an active comparator. A placebo will look identical to the study drug, but won't contain any active ingredients, so sometimes referred to as a sugar pill, for example. And these controls are very important as they serve as the base of comparison for the product that's being tested. For blinding, you may have heard the term single blind or double blinding, talked about that a little bit. Blinding refers to the masking where the participant or the researchers are unaware of what study treatment is being, that they're taking. And blinding is really critical and crucial to a trial because it lessens the ability to introduce bias if individuals know what treatment they're receiving. As you can imagine, if the participant knows they're taking placebo, they may act differently or report different outcomes than if they know they're taking an active medication. And the same for the researchers that are reporting outcomes on those participants. And lastly, an endpoint is an event or an outcome that is defined prior to the start of the study. The endpoint is the item that is measured to see if what you're testing is beneficial. So an example of a common study endpoint that we see in PWS clinical trials would be change in hyperphagia during the course of treatment. Next slide. FDA defines rare disease as a condition that affects less than 200,000 people in the United States. A drug used to treat rare disease is called an orphan drug. And you may have seen several PWS drugs in development have announced that they've received orphan drug status, meaning that the FDA has agreed that the drug met that criteria. And the Orphan Drug Act was passed in the 1980s to facilitate the development of orphan drugs. So trials in rare disorders can be significantly, as I have said many times, significantly more difficult in many ways and harder to enroll, and also harder to demonstrate significant differences versus placebo, and in turn can make it a high risk for few or no treatments to undergo development by companies. So with the passing of this act, there are some savings that a company will receive for development of drugs in rare diseases. And when we're talking about Prader-Willi syndrome, this is considered very rare, with affecting fewer than 30,000 individuals in the United States. Next slide. Sorry, moving my slides too. So who is involved in a clinical trial? There are many people needed and involved for the operations of a clinical trial. First is the sponsor. That's the group that initiates the study. It could be a pharmaceutical company, a research center, a voluntary group, a doctor, or another organization. And the investigator is the individual or individuals that are responsible for the medical care of the participant or oversight of the clinical trial at the study center. So there could be many centers across the world, and the investigator is responsible for the care of the patients at their individual center. The investigators also do have a clinical research staff or study coordinators that help facilitate the day-to-day activities. And they play a very key role, probably individuals that the participant would interact with regularly for the study coordination at the site. And last, but certainly not least, is the participant of the utmost importance for our clinical trials. Okay, next slide. So the question came up of how are sites chosen for a clinical trial, and some of the timeline for a clinical trial includes setting up the study site locations, and a lot does go into choosing the right sites to participate in a trial. There are some key criteria used to select a site, including, do they have the patient population? What is the investigator's experience and expertise, and are they interested in participating? Do they have the expertise that we need, especially in a rare disorder, to be able to oversee and monitor the patients that they will enroll that are taking a new study treatment? And we need to ensure that the clinical site has experienced staff and the appropriate facilities to conduct the trial and perform all the assessments safely. And in rare diseases, as I had mentioned, this can be challenging as the patients are limited, and so are the investigators who treat the rare disease or specialize in a certain disorder. So with some of these limitations, there may be fewer sites that we can get to participate and that are right for participating in the clinical study. And that may require the participants to have to travel great distances to a recruiting center that's open. It can take anywhere from 2 to 8 months for a site to get to the point of recruiting patients, considering a great amount of approvals that are needed and steps necessary to get them ready to enroll a patient. And Kristen will go into a little bit more detail on that. That concludes my portion of the presentation, and now I'm happy to turn it over to Kristen.
Thank you so much, Jess. Once again, my name is Kristen Yen, and I am the head of clinical operations at Soleno Therapeutics. And you've heard already a lot from Jess and Dean about how we do clinical research. But what we also wanted to provide to you today is just a brief background of the framework which all clinical studies are based upon. And this would be the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And this actually appeared first as the Pure Food and Drug Act in the early 1900s, which prohibited the sale of misbranded or adulterated food and drugs. And also this act, this early act, laid out the foundation for the nation's first consumer protection agency, the FDA, or the Food and Drug Administration. So this act actually gives the FDA the authority and oversight, allows them to have oversight of clinical investigations to test the safety and effectiveness of investigational products or study drugs. There are regulations under this act that actually give them this authority, and for us to be able to conduct clinical investigations. And specifically, it'll include many things, as well as sponsor responsibilities and the responsibilities of clinical investigators. The FDA also provides us with guidance documents. And basically, these documents outline their interpretation of these regulations. And they assist us, the sponsors, as well as clinical investigators, in the ability to comply with the regulations. Additionally, there are also international ethical and scientific quality standards that have been prepared by the EU, Japan, and the United States. And this gives us the standards for designing, conducting, recording, and reporting trials that involve human subjects. And of those guidelines, there's about 41 of them. And for us in clinical, we specifically follow the good clinical practice, which is also referred to as ICH E6 R2. And essentially, this guidance provides a unified standard for these countries to facilitate the mutual acceptance of clinical data by the regulatory authorities in those jurisdictions. And again, when we follow GCP, that allows us to ensure that the rights, safety, and well-being of subjects are protected, and that the clinical trial data are credible. Next slide. So you heard Dean and Jess, they spoke about different phases of studies, phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. All of these require a clinical trial protocol. And the content of that protocol is actually outlined in the regulations, specifically 21 CFR 312, as well as ICH GCP E6 R2. So what is a clinical trial protocol? Well, it's a research plan that details how a study is going to be conducted. It's designed to answer specific research questions, as well as safeguarding the health and safety of participants. Protocols contain the reason why the study is being conducted, for example, the rationale of the study. It also includes eligibility criteria, which describes who may participate in the study, as well as describes how many patients will need to participate to be able to answer the question that we're trying to answer. It will describe the tests and the procedures that will be performed, as well as when those tests and procedures will be performed. It describes the study drug that's being researched, as well as the timing of the administration and how that study drug will be administered. And also, if there are particular questionnaires or any information that needs to be gathered by from the participant, that will also be outlined in the protocol. And really, in order for us to be able to answer the questions that we're trying to answer, it is vital for the investigator and their study team to follow this protocol or this document. As with all phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials, before the initiation of those studies, the protocol must be submitted to the FDA for review. And within that review, they are required to provide us with responses and feedback on the protocol. And as Jess mentioned earlier, if we don't receive a response, then we're allowed to proceed with that protocol. In addition, the protocol and related study documents are submitted to several other groups. One must be the Institutional Review Board. Also, if the protocol contains scans, which would expose a participant to radiation, perhaps a radiation committee at a hospital would need to review and approve that protocol. Next slide. So as I said, the protocols include eligibility criteria, and really that describes who can participate in a clinical trial. And breaking it down, the eligibility criteria includes inclusion criteria, which lists out the factors that allow someone to participate, as well as exclusion criteria, which are the factors that disallow someone from participating. There are many criteria in this, and many of those factors include age, sex, type, and stage of disease, as well as previous treatment history and other medical conditions. And the intent of the eligibility criteria is to ensure that patients are kept safe, that the researchers achieved accurate and meaningful results, as well as reduce the variation within the study. So essentially, the eligibility criteria helps us define the subject population and keep it as uniform as possible. So again, we can answer the questions that we're trying to answer and to see if the study drug that we are researching is safe and effective. And again, it's worth mentioning that not everyone is eligible to participate in a protocol, in a particular study. And in that, it could be that the patient is not of age or within the age range that's required in that protocol, or they may not have that particular, they have the disease, but they might not be at that particular stage of their disease to make them eligible for the protocol. Here, what is of most importance is that participation should always be voluntary, and the participant and family be well informed by the researchers at the clinical site about the study details and their level of commitment when participating in a protocol. Next slide. And this is part of what is called the informed consent process. And again, before any patient or participates in any clinical trial, they do go through this informed consent process. This gives them the opportunity to learn everything about the clinical trial before they decide whether or not to participate. And this is an ongoing process. It continues throughout the study participation. It's extremely important that the patients, when they are considering to participate in a study, that they are aware of all of their benefits and risks. And it's important for the participant to understand all aspects of the clinical trial before participating, as well as ensuring that all of their questions are answered. One thing that investigators and clinical staff do is they assure that the participants' personal information is only seen and available to those who are authorized to have access. So that would include the clinical site, the investigator, as well as the sponsor and its representatives, and perhaps the institutional review board if they do feel like they need to audit the study, or perhaps the FDA if they come and inspect the clinical study and the clinical site. So throughout the conduct of a study, if there is any new safety information that arises, whether it's because of an adverse event that was experienced by a subject who is participating in that current study, or by a subject in other studies with the same drug, or even if something was learned in a preclinical research experiment, that information is passed back to the subject who is participating in the study by the investigator to inform them and ensure that they're aware that there is this new safety risk. Again, giving them the opportunity to decide whether or not to continue to participate in the study. So next slide. So we've already talked about the FDA and how they are responsible for safeguarding public health by ensuring the current and new medical products are safe and effective, and also the ongoing evaluation of potential new therapies and ensuring that that is done properly. Listed here are the different regulations that we follow when we are conducting clinical trials. Next, the other group that protects the participants in clinical studies, as I mentioned, is the Institutional Review Board. I had indicated that the protocol is before that is conducted at a particular site is submitted to the IRB. And the IRB is responsible for reviewing this clinical research to ensure that the appropriate steps are taken to protect the rights and welfare of the human subjects participating in that clinical trial. They use a group review process to review these protocols, as well as related materials, which include the informed consent form, the investigator brochure, which is equivalent to a package insert for a investigational new drug. They also may review recruitment materials to ensure that there isn't anything that is misleading or would encourage a patient to participate in a study that would not be good for them to participate in. The IRB actually has the authority to require modifications before they approve a protocol. They do approve, or they could disapprove research. Next slide, please. So another group that actually protects the subjects participating in a clinical trial is a data and safety monitoring board. And this term has been used most recently in the news with regards to one of the clinical trials that is going on with the COVID-19 vaccination. So most of you have probably heard of recently of a data and safety monitoring board. They're also referred to as data monitoring committees or a data and safety monitoring committee. This sponsor typically establishes a DSMB for a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial. And this is an independent group of experts who assess the progress of a trial. They review the safety data, sometimes efficacy variables, and they have the obligation to recommend a modification if they see any safety issues, or if they see significant safety issues, they could even terminate the study. Prior to actually reviewing the data, they have a written charter that has been reviewed and approved by its members. And also they document their meetings when they do review the data. And that is, within that is also included their decision whether the study can continue as it was designed, or if they recommend any modifications, or if they do need to terminate the study. In addition to physicians who are typically on a data and safety monitoring board, there are also scientists and statisticians with appropriate knowledge to effectively evaluate the data that they are reviewing. And of utmost importance here is that the data monitoring board is actually it's independent of the sponsor, and that is crucial and critical to maintain its integrity. And you see here below, I've referenced, oh, go back, please. I referenced the regulations, the CFR 312, as well as ICH GCP, and there is specifically a guidance document that talks about the establishment and operation of clinical trial data monitoring committees. Thanks, next slide. So I'm going to close out this section and talk about the responsibilities of some of the key players in clinical trials. One being the sponsor, as well as the clinical investigator and the participant. So we sponsors are responsible for selecting qualified investigators. And that is, like, if we are conducting a study in PWS, then we are going to look for physicians who actually treat patients with PWS. We would not conduct that study with a group of cardiologists. We also are responsible for providing investigators with the information that they need to conduct the clinical study properly. And for us, primarily, that starts with the protocol and being able to provide information clearly and succinctly for the investigators to follow when they are conducting the clinical study. We need to ensure that the studies are properly monitored. And with that, we have an ongoing review of data from a safety perspective, and that is conducted by a medical monitor. We also have monitors who go to the sites and they review the data that's been collected at each of the clinical study visits and ensure that what's been entered into the database is accurate and complete. We ensure that the studies are being conducted in accordance with the protocol. And also we are responsible for maintaining an effective IND. We need to ensure that when there are any significant new adverse risks or effects that come up with respect to the study drug, that we inform the FDA as well as all of the participating investigators. And again, it's the responsibility of the investigator to inform the subject of these risks. So the subject can have the opportunity to decide whether or not it is beneficial for them to continue to participate in the study. Next slide, please. Now, as far as the investigator is concerned, they need to ensure that they are conducting the study according to the study protocol. As always, they need to make sure that they protect the rights, safety, and welfare of all subjects participating. They are responsible for informing the patient about the study and obtaining that informed consent adequately and appropriately. They need to ensure that the IRB has reviewed and approved the protocol before they start conducting that protocol, and that they report anything that is necessary and required by the IRB. They need to maintain the control of the study drug, and that means that they are only dispensing and allowing subjects who are participating in the study to take that study drug. They need to maintain accurate records and retain these records, and these records need to be available to the sponsor and its representatives when they are conducting monitoring visits, as well as available to the IRB and the FDA in the event of an inspection. They need to submit progress reports as well as final reports to the sponsor and to the IRB. And it's their responsibility to report any side effects or adverse events that are alarming, which could be something that is an unexpected event that is serious or life-threatening. And that is reported to us, which in turn we are responsible for reporting it to the FDA. And again, the investigator is responsible for informing their subjects about any adverse event that is alarming. And again, they're obligated to provide a financial disclosure to the sponsor, ensuring that they do not have any financial ties or significant financial ties to the sponsor that would create any bias in this clinical study that they are participating in. Next slide, please. Lastly, and most importantly, the participants. And they need to be willing to come to the study visit appointments as scheduled with the study staff. And again, enabling the investigator to conduct the study according to the protocol. They need to follow all instructions of the investigator and the study staff. And it's very important that they report any side effects or any changes in the medicines that they have been taking. They need to agree to take the study medication as instructed. And they are not supposed to participate in any other clinical trial when they are participating in one clinical trial. And most importantly, they need to understand that their participation is voluntary, and at any time, they may withdraw from the study without penalty or loss of access to treatment or other benefits to which they are entitled. And I do believe this next slide is my last slide. And as Dean had presented, there's a lot of information out there available to you. And here are some websites that are links that you can go to if you want to learn more about clinical trials. And also, if you want to see which studies are recruiting, you can go to clinicaltrials.gov. And what you see here on the screen is an example of the form that you would fill out. And you can enter the condition or disease, as well as indicate that you're looking for those studies that are recruiting. You can indicate your location, and it will provide results with that information or those criteria. So again, thank you very much. And I do believe Michelle is going to go on to some more information about the NDA and drug approval process.
Thank you, Kristen. I'm Michelle Roy from Harmony Biosciences, and we just heard a lot of information about research and development for investigational products. And once there is the sufficient non-clinical, clinical, and manufacturing work is completed, it brings us to the new drug application or NDA stage in the process. So essentially, an NDA is the sponsor's formal approval to FDA to approve a product for marketing and sale in the US. It is very complex. It builds on and brings together all that was done and submitted during the IND phase. And it really includes, we break it down into 5 buckets, 5 sections, which in industry we refer to as modules. We have the administrative information for the application, which is in module 1. There's comprehensive summaries for each discipline in Module 2. All of the chemistry, manufacturing, and controls information is included in Module 3, the non-clinical data in Module 4, and the clinical data in Module 5. The application gets submitted electronically in a format that we refer to as the Common Technical Document. And it's really a standard that is set by FDA and other countries to ensure consistency within the application submission and increase the efficiency, hopefully, of the regulatory authorities' review of the application. So as I said, there's an agreement to assemble all of the quality, safety, and efficacy information in a common format. This is a diagram that is very helpful just to sort of illustrate that. We use it quite frequently in industry. The bottom row is the very detailed information that lays the foundation for the entire application, and it's broken into the modules 3 through 5. Module 3 is what we call quality, which refers to all the manufacturing information, the chemistry information about the actual product. Then Module 4 is the non-clinical study reports, and then 5 is the clinical study reports. What sits on top of that are what we call our summary sections in Module 2. And these sections pull all the details from the lower sections into very comprehensive summaries. So there's a summary for the quality information. There's actually a non-clinical and clinical summaries, and then there's an additional summary above those, which we call non-clinical and clinical overview. These summaries are really important, and a lot of times during the review at FDA, the higher level FDA reviewers will really focus on the summaries and not get into the details like the more detailed reviewers will. So it's an important way to convey important information to the higher level reviewers. Module 1 is country specific, and it's, as I said, it's administrative, but importantly, it also includes the proposed labeling for the product. Next slide. So the NDA must provide sufficient data for the FDA to determine the safety and efficacy profile of the product. And this profile then informs their assessment of whether there's an acceptable risk benefit of the product. It also needs to provide the product quality information. We haven't really spent a lot of time on that, but I just want to note that, all of the manufacturing for the product and the components of the actual, chemical of the product, there's a lot of information in the NDA as well. And the sponsor needs to show that they can manufacture in a way that preserves the identity, strength, and purity of the product. And as was mentioned earlier, there are countless FDA and ICH guidance documents to cover all aspects of clinical development and the NDA process. And the FDA, the website provides a wealth of information if you're looking to just get some more details about this. Okay, next slide, please. Along the way with the FDA, the sponsor, I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the things that have gone on with the sponsor during the IND process and their interactions with FDA. So the sponsor can conduct milestone meetings with FDA. These are formal meetings conducted where they can discuss the development program, address questions that come up, obtain agreement for specific questions or issues. And typically they're done at different times, at the pre-IND phase, the end of phase 1, the end of phase 2, and then the pre-NDA phase. FDA also has developed programs to expedite drug development and review, and this is really designed for products for life-threatening serious conditions where there is an unmet medical need. And I just thought I'd list them here. The earliest of these is fast track designation, which would allow for more frequent communications with FDA during the IND phase. Breakthrough therapy designation is a little bit more recent, and if a product is designated as breakthrough therapy, it's because it has shown preliminary evidence of some superior, perhaps efficacy or safety profile. Again, it's for where there's an unmet medical need. And when this designation is granted, the FDA commits to providing more intense guidance and perhaps involvement of senior people at FDA as needed to bring the development program along. Accelerated approval is available, It's approval based on a surrogate endpoint, but it also requires that more data will be needed after approval to confirm the approval decision. It's designed to really get a drug product out to people with unmet medical needs more quickly. And then priority review is, if that's granted, it just commits, the FDA commits to a shorter review time for the NDA. Next slide. So the submission process, before the NDA is submitted, it's quite a lot of work the sponsor goes through to put this all together. The NDA, the application has to be written and compiled. It involves multiple subject matter experts, writers and authors of all these sections that make up the NDA, reviewers, and then even, there's the technical part of it, the document publishers, the experts who build the electronic submission per FDA requirements, and project management to track all the timelines, the movement of documents through the process from draft to finalization. And then on the regulatory side, the regulatory oversees all of this and guides it as well as drives the process. Next slide. One thing I just wanted to talk about was what we refer to as the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, or called PDUFA. This is a law that authorizes the FDA to collect user fees for applications and approve products once they're out on the market. Every year, FDA evaluates what their need will be based on their proposed budget and the expected number of applications that they will receive. And so the application fee is set for every one of their fiscal years. And here I'm just illustrating, what it was in 2020. It was almost $3 million. It actually went down just a little bit in 2021. Again, that would have been based on the projected number of applications that they expected to receive. So it is a costly fee just to submit a new drug application, but it's worth noting that products designated as orphan products are exempt from that fee. Next slide. So based on the PDUFA regulations, FDA is expected to meet review timeline goals, performance goals, for 90% of the applications that they receive. And they actually do better than that. I think typically every year they release their statistics for how well they're meeting this timeline. And it's usually greater than 90% of applications are being, their performance goals are being met. It's really kind of broken down into a couple of buckets, whether a product is a new chemical entity or it's not a new chemical entity. And in both cases, a standard review is 10 months and a priority review is 6 months. But the difference is the clock start date. For a non-NCE, the clock starts the day the application is submitted. So it's 10 months or 6 months if it's priority review from the day the application gets submitted. For an NCE, that clock starts at the filing date, which is 60 days after the application gets submitted. It's still 10 months versus 6 months, but the clock starts 2 months later. So just kind of point that out, that it does take longer for an NCE. It's a compound that the FDA has not seen before, and so they theoretically will need a little bit more time to review all of the information. Okay. So at a high level, FDA review teams thoroughly examine all the submitted data related to the drug, and they have to make a decision about whether they're going to approve or not to approve it. So upon receipt at the FDA, it goes through an initial administrative processing. It's forwarded to the division who's going to be responsible for the review and assigned to a division project manager. That person is really the main point of contact for the sponsor then, between the sponsor and the reviewers. The sponsor doesn't have direct interaction with the review team at FDA. It's all done through correspondence with the project manager. The application is screened to assess for completeness, and then the technical sections are distributed to reviewers in the primary technical review divisions, such as medical and clinical, pharmacology, toxicology, the chemistry, microbiology, which is the manufacturing. And then usually there are also consultant reviewers that are outside of the actual review team, such as the statistical reviewers, if there's going to be a device consultation, and clinical outcome assessment division might get involved if there are patient-reported outcomes in the application. Next slide. So the review process is divided into phases. And the first really key milestone is either by day 60 or day 74. So by day 60, the FDA will inform the sponsor if priority review is being granted, if that was requested for the application, or if the application will be refused to be filed. And that's where I said initially they do an assessment of completeness, and if the application isn't considered complete, they will refuse to file it. So by day 60, that will be communicated to the sponsor. If neither one of those apply, then by day 74, the communication goes out that says the application is going to be filed. It tells the sponsor the PDUFA goal date, and it provides any initial questions to the sponsor, requests for information. During the review process, there's a lot of back and forth, and the FDA review team will communicate additional requests for information. Many times when they're reviewing the application, there's information they maybe want to know more about, or they maybe want some additional data analyses run, but those questions go back and forth. And it's really important the sponsor is sort of at the ready of FDA to turn things around very quickly. Usually when a question comes back to the sponsor, there isn't a lot of time to get an answer back to FDA if you want to stay on that review timeline. Any type of major amendment or significant amount of information that gets submitted during the last 3 months of the review can extend the PDUFA goal date by 3 months. Next slide. Another important activity that often takes place during the review timeline is an advisory committee meeting. And some applications are more likely to go to an advisory committee meeting, those being for a new chemical entity, anything for a novel clinical or perhaps surrogate endpoint, maybe if there are significant issues regarding safety or efficacy, and if there's any kind of public health questions. This gets communicated early to the sponsor in the review cycle. There's a lot of preparation that is involved, but it really provides FDA with an independent advice from outside experts. FDA often follows the advice of the advisory committee meeting, but they're not required to do so. And importantly, these meetings are open to the public. So it's an opportunity, there's an opportunity set aside, there's time set aside in each meeting for the public to speak. And it's really one mechanism for patients, patient advocates to speak and make their concerns or needs known to the panel and to the FDA. And I've been to a lot of these meetings, and I can say that both the panel and the FDA members at these meetings are always very attentive and interested to hear the public's opinion. Next slide. So the review process really ends, well, it moves toward, when we're getting toward the end, if the application is favoring an approval, then the agency will start to negotiate the final labeling with the sponsor, which is always a good sign for the sponsor because the labeling needs to be agreed upon and approved by FDA. At this time, each review discipline is also writing a review summary. And this is really important because these eventually get posted to the FDA's website and it's called the summary basis of approval. It provides a wealth of information that is considered publicly disclosable regarding the application. It's a good place to go for the public to go to for information about the review. What was determined by the different disciplines, what kind of questions came up, what assessments were made. It just provides a lot of insight into how the FDA comes to the decision to either approve or not approve the product. So at the time of action, oops, back one more, where are we? Yeah, there we are. At the time of action, the sponsor will either get an approval letter or a complete response letter. If a complete response letter is issued, it will describe the deficiencies that have been identified during the review of the application. And it will help the sponsor to understand what needs to be done in order to eventually get the drug approved. Next slide. And importantly, if a complete response letter is issued, it does not mean that the drug is finished and there's no path forward. There is an opportunity for a post-action teleconference or meeting to discuss the deficiencies with the review division. This is a really important interaction. It will help the sponsor understand what needs to be done to potentially get the drug approved. The application can be resubmitted, but it has to be a complete response to all the deficiencies that have been identified. So it's important to understand what the agency expects for a resubmission. And the resubmissions are classified based on what kind of information is being resubmitted. If it's something that's not if it's minor updates, it's considered class 1 and it can be reviewed in 2 months' time. Most of them are class 2 and it would be reviewed in a 6-month time period. Next slide. I just wanted to touch on quickly because there has been an increased awareness of the topic of patient-focused drug development at FDA and with patient advocacy groups in the rare disease space. It's really about having a more systematic approach to help ensure that patients' experiences and perspectives, needs and priorities are captured and understood and meaningfully incorporated into drug development and evaluation. So briefly, just the primary goal is to better understand the patient's voice in drug development by collecting and utilizing robust and meaningful patient and caregiver input to facilitate patient enrollment and minimize the burden of patient participation in clinical trials. Sometimes there's just a lot that's required for participants in clinical trials. It's really to understand better patient preferences and what constitutes for patients a treatment benefit and what their tolerance for risk is, which really identifies the information that is most important to patients and to help to inform FDA about what is important to them and what needs to be incorporated into applications, into clinical trials, and into labeling. Next slide. Clinical trials traditionally really relied on very objective measures for primary and secondary endpoints. It was, FDA issued guidance as early as 2009 regarding patient-reported outcomes and trying to incorporate that into the drug development process. That was strengthened later in 2016 with the 21st Century Cures Act, and then in 2017 again with the 6th reauthorization of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act. So based on these initiatives, FDA has since issued 2 additional guidance documents in 2019 and 2020 that was based on 2 initial workshops with patient groups. And then they've had since then 2 additional workshops and in 2018 and 2019. And those guidance documents are still pending and they are to be released at some point based on those workshops. So it was really a way for FDA to talk to patients, patient advocacy groups, and find out, how to do better with this patient-focused drug development. In addition, a division of clinical outcome assessment group was established at FDA. Their mission is to try and incorporate the patient voice into drug development with clinical outcome assessment endpoints that are meaningful to patients, but at the same time, valid and reliable and show response to treatment, which is important to FDA. So it really tries to bridge the patient input with the regulatory rigor that's needed for endpoints in clinical trials. So FDA is clearly making strides in this area, but there is still work to be done. And from an industry perspective, it still is somewhat unclear what may be acceptable to FDA. It's complicated to validate assessment tools. And also, there's not consistent feedback or acceptance of some of these tools across different review divisions and what can be eventually included in the label. So there's still work to be done, but we've definitely are moving in the right direction with it. Sometimes change at FDA just takes a little bit longer time. And then I just like to end with a slide that highlights the FDA's mission statement, because I think it's really important to remember. I think FDA is always under a lot of scrutiny, but primarily they're responsible for protecting the public health by assuring safety, efficacy, and the security of medicinal products. They also really are looking to advance public health, and I think that we have seen a really good example of this in our current situation in their response to the pandemic that we're facing, with all of the emergency use authorizations that they have been involved with testing for the virus, and treatment medications, potential treatments, and as well as vaccines. So I think that, that illustrates very well how they uphold their mission. And that brings me to the end.
Wonderful. I would just like to thank Michelle, Kristen, Jessica, and Dean for a very informative presentation today. We do have a few minutes left, and we've had a few questions come in, so let's try to take those right now. The first couple of questions I think go together, and I think Kristen might have touched on some of the eligibility criteria, but the questions are, how do you find healthy volunteers for clinical trials? And are surveys emailed or sent out that will help determine if an individual is eligible for a clinical trial?
So I can speak to the surveys. And again, I think that that's something that would be more study specific, and any information that would be sent out to a prospective patient to see if they would qualify or not would need to be initially reviewed by the IRB and ensure that it is in line and consistent with the protocol. I don't know if Jess has done that in any of her clinical trials. I'm not aware of any of my sites currently that have sent out a survey to say or inform someone about what the requirements are for them to be to learn about what's required in that clinical trial or what the eligibility criteria are.
Yeah, Kristen, you're correct. I have the same experience. We do have a high level of the eligibility criteria is listed on clinicaltrials.gov. If you're interested in participating, sometimes on the company website, you could find more information on that. But usually the reach out for participation in a clinical trial comes from the investigator or the study coordinator having a direct conversation with the potential caregiver or participant about what's needed, and a review of the medical records and history, and answering questions to understand if they are eligible.
Great, thank you.
I could maybe just add a little bit too, from the perspective of having participated in phase 1 clinical trials as a healthy volunteer. So these sites, and then also having conducted phase 1 clinical trials as well as a drug developer. So the phase 1 sites typically have a database of people, so that it's kind of the matchmaking process that happens when a new clinical trial or a new drug is being brought into phase 1 and the clinical trial is set up, and then those sites will reach out to potential participants, or it might also happen the other way around, that there might be some advertisement out there for that study, and then people will link up to it. So it's not it's not like it's posted on big billboards or something like that. It is kind of hard to find, but if you do a Google search, you might find local phase 1 sites in your area, and you can make contact with them and get on their registry.
And I think both of the PWS organizations, we both try to share those clinical trials that are coming up and opportunities. So also on our website, as well as FPWR's website. Another question is, what do you wish more people in the rare disease community knew or understood about clinical trials?
Well, I'll start off by just saying that it's being able to have access to information and understanding that what we as sponsors need to do as far as a clinical trial is concerned, as well as what the responsibilities are of the investigators, as we've outlined here in our presentation. And I think most importantly is understanding, if they do participate in a clinical trial, what their responsibilities are, and being able to adhere as much as they can to the protocol, because that's really vital. If we do have protocol compliance, therefore the data that we're collecting it'll help it be more credible and give us the opportunity to be able to evaluate it and analyze it and put together the story, and then eventually get to the point of sharing that and submitting that information to the FDA for ultimately approval of a product. I don't know if Jess, if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I totally agree, Kristen. And being with rare disease, we only have the ability to enroll so many patients. So one patient's participation is so valuable, and we don't have a lot of room for error with missed assessments. So like you said, Kristen, with the responsibility of the participant or the caregiver, if it's a pediatric trial, to make sure that you are adhering to the visits and providing the information accurately, because every data point really counts, especially when it comes to a rare disease trial.
Great.
Yeah, I think a big thing, and this is the everything to do with clinical trials, is it's about transparency and about honesty, and making sure that both the participants are asking as many questions of the sites and of the sponsors as possible, but also that they're giving as much accurate information as possible. It's, the clinical trials are the short-term path to the long-term availability of medications. And if you're trying to shortcut even further that pathway through going through the clinical trials, and it leads to mishaps in the study, or the drug doesn't end up getting approved, then it's not a good outcome.
Great, thank you. Another question, can you talk a little bit about the inclusion and exclusion criteria and how that's determined specifically for PWS?
Who wants to take that one? I can speak to at least our phase 3 trial, and how there is specific criteria for the subject to have a genetic confirmation of PWS. So there is criteria that are specific to PWS, as well as just knowing about the safety of our particular drug. We make sure that that who we're recruiting into the study would not have may not have an adverse reaction to that drug. Maybe they could have an allergy to diazoxide. Therefore, we don't want that patient to be in the study. So really, as far as the inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's really determined on a case-by-case basis for each protocol.
Okay, and I'm assuming we have another question about, what if I have a medically complex child, maybe not just with PWS, maybe another genetic disorder, or just, again, more medically complex. How do you decide if they can join? I'm assuming it's on a case-by-case basis through an interview process, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
This is Michelle. I was just going to say, also FDA does weigh in, as Jess and Kristen said, the FDA, we submit the protocols to FDA and they do come back with comments. And sometimes, because these are controlled studies and we have to control some factors, and depending on the drug product as well. For example, if there are potential for drug interactions with other drugs, to just really try and keep the variables as under control as possible. But FDA will sometimes weigh in and ask the sponsor to consider certain exclusion criteria or inclusion criteria.
Okay. I know we're just a few minutes over. We have 2 more questions. I'll try to take these really quick. Can you talk a little bit about compassionate use?
From a regulatory perspective, FDA has a process in place for expanded access, oftentimes called compassionate use. And there are a number of different avenues in order to pursue that, depending on what the situation is. And FDA is very open to allowing access to investigational medications in situations where it's a serious or life-threatening condition, and there's an unmet medical need. There is not something else approved for that condition. But ultimately, they can't force a manufacturer to provide the product. So it's also, that's the other part of it, is working with the sponsor and manufacturer if they have a program available to provide the product on a compassionate use basis. One of the things FDA is concerned about is compassionate use is available to a patient if they are not able to be enrolled in an available clinical trial. So that is one aspect that comes into play with being eligible for compassionate use.
Okay, great. We just have a comment really quick to thank all of the presenters. This was very informational and we appreciate it. And with that, I think, we are over. So I just would like to reiterate that. Thank you for our presenters giving up your time today on a Saturday, and everybody in the community who joined us. And we certainly appreciate everything and hope you enjoyed. There will be a recording of this posted on our website in the next couple of days. So thank you everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.